The ranch was quiet that morning, almost unnervingly so. The sun rose slowly over the rolling hills, casting golden light across my fenced property. The scent of hay and livestock filled the air. My cows were lowing, the chickens pecked in their corral, and my 2 border collies lazily sprawled in the dirt, eyes half closed. It should have been an ordinary day, but there was a tension that I could feel in my bones, a sense that something was off. I had bought this ranch 5 years ago, looking for peace after years of active duty. After 2 deployments overseas, countless missions, and the chaos of Navy operations, I thought I could finally rest here. My small red barn, the corral, and the rolling fields were my sanctuary. I had stocked a few firearms, not for aggression, but for protection. My neighbors respected the property lines, and I had never had a problem. That peace, however, had a way of attracting attention in unexpected forms. Last month, the HOA had sent a notice, cryptic, vague, and oddly threatening. They claimed someone had complaints about me storing firearms on my property. I'd shrugged it off. After all, I owned the land and the law was on my side. But then came the calls. Middle-of-the-night phone calls with distorted voices asking me to cooperate with HOA security inspections. The messages left a cold taste in my mouth. Something felt dangerously staged. I finished my morning coffee on the porch, eyes scanning the horizon. My gut, a honed instinct from years of tactical operations, tensed. Then I saw them. 3 black SUVs crawling up the dirt road toward my property. The vehicles didn't have police markings, at least not official ones. Instead, the doors had vinyl stickers that vaguely resembled badges. They were too clean, too pristine, almost theatrical in their execution. My heart sank. I knew immediately this wasn't a routine visit. These were imposters, someone trying to intimidate me. I grabbed my binoculars and watched as a man in a dark suit stepped out of the lead SUV, holding what looked like a police-issued notebook. Another 2 men fanned out behind him, eyes scanning my property, hands near their waists. Even from a distance, I could see the fake confidence, the rehearsed authority. I didn't panic. I never did. Not during ambushes in foreign deserts, not when my team was pinned down during operations, and certainly not on my own land. I quickly retreated to the barn and began to prepare. Every firearm was checked, every magazine loaded. My comms were set up, and I ran through the protocols I had trained for countless times in the Navy. This was no longer just about property rights. This was a potential threat, and I was going to respond with precision. The imposters approached cautiously. I could hear their muffled voices through the barn doors. "Sir, we're here on official HOA business. Step outside calmly, and no one will be harmed." I chuckled under my breath. Official HOA business. They had no authority here beyond thin paper notices. I opened the barn door slightly, enough to peek out without revealing my full position. "What's your authority?" I called. My voice was calm, controlled, carrying the weight of someone who had faced real danger before. "Property inspection. You're required to surrender any restricted items," the lead man said, his voice slightly shaking. It was rehearsed, but poorly. I stepped out fully, letting my dogs roam in front of me. They growled softly, picking up on the tension. I raised a hand. "You're on private property. This is not a law enforcement action. Leave now or you'll face the consequences." The lead man smirked, signaling the others forward. That smirk was the first real mistake they made. My response was immediate. I moved with precision, stepping into the open, letting them see that I was calm, collected, and fully capable. My right hand hovered near my holstered sidearm, not in threat, but in readiness. My eyes scanned every movement, every subtle shift in their stance. And then I acted. Using techniques drilled into me from years in special operations, I disrupted their formation. A quick burst of controlled shouts and gestures sent their second SUV skidding on the loose dirt. My dogs lunged, but I called them back, controlling the engagement carefully. Panic spread across the imposters' faces. They were not trained for this. They were amateurs, relying on theatrics and false authority. I had experience, tactics, and terrain on my side. Every move they made was countered before it could escalate. In less than 5 minutes, the supposed raid had devolved into chaos. One man tripped over a rock, sprawling into the dirt. Another dropped his notebook, scrambling to pick it up. The lead imposter raised his hands, realizing he had misjudged his opponent. And I hadn't even drawn my firearm yet. I spoke clearly, deliberately, with authority only years of combat could give. "Leave my property, now, or the next time you come it won't be a demonstration, understand?" They didn't need more persuasion. The SUVs backed up, tires spinning in the dirt as they fled down the winding road, leaving only dust and tension behind. I closed the barn door, my heart still racing. This was a warning, not an end. Whoever sent these imposters underestimated me, and they would pay for it if they tried again. I had contacts, old Navy protocols, surveillance tactics, and counterintelligence knowledge. They thought they could intimidate a retired operator. They were wrong. I looked out over the ranch. The sun was now fully risen, casting shadows over the land. My cows had stopped grazing, the chickens had returned to pecking, and my dogs were alert but calm. The battlefield had returned to peace, at least for now. I knew one thing for certain: this was not over. The HOA, or whoever was behind the stunt, had made a fatal mistake. They had picked a fight with someone trained in precision, patience, and decisive action, and I was just getting started. They came back 2 days later. Not with swagger or theatrics this time, but quiet, careful, the way predators move when they think their prey is asleep. I saw the first sign from the kitchen window, a blue sedan rolling slowly past the entrance to my lane, slowing its pace as if reading the street signs. It wasn't the SUVs, it was a scout. Someone who wanted to know what I'd done after the stunt. Someone who wanted to see whether the man they'd rattled would retaliate or retreat. I didn't answer right away. Revenge fantasies are cheap, the work that follows is not. My life after the Navy had taught me to be patient, surgical. I spent a decade learning to kill time with surveillance until a single mistake gave me everything I needed. 2 days was long enough to measure their fear, short enough to keep them from regrouping. I poured coffee, put on a weathered trucker cap, and walked out onto the porch like a man who had nowhere to hide. The sedan moved on. Inside the barn, I did what I'd known how to do before I could be trusted to babysit a kettle. Check, catalog, secure. I inventoried everything I owned: shotguns, rifles, pistols, maintenance gear, ammo. Then I documented it with timestamps, serial numbers, photos. Photographs could be manipulated, but they were evidence, harder to argue away if the paperwork was done right. I uploaded the files to a secure drive and distributed copies to a couple of old contacts who owed me favors and wouldn't blink if I disappeared for a week. Politics weren't my thing anymore, but leverage was universal. I also did something else. I watched. I wired the barn with cameras, cheap, rugged units one might buy off a military surplus site and adapt. They blended into the corrugated metal and the rafters. A pair watched the drive, a third scanned the fence line, and 2 more nested in the trees like dead birds. The dogs adjusted to the camera housings like they adjusted to everything, with unthinking indifference. I set the feed to a local network, looped a recorder, and ran a checksum routine to detect tampering. If these imposters were organized, they'd try to approach undercover. I would be ready for them. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my recliner with a thermos of coffee, eyes glued to a bank of screens. There is a peculiar calm that comes with watching. The world moves on, oblivious, while you draw maps of intent from the small things. Headlights lingering too long, a package dropped at the roadside and picked up too quickly, patterns that mean people. By dawn, I'd logged 3 suspicious vehicles and 2 men who kept appearing in different places, like chess pieces being tested. One of those men, broad shoulders under a windbreaker, a habit of tilting his head when he listened, caught my attention. He carried himself like a professional. He chewed his lip when he thought people couldn't see. He traveled light. That was the difference between a stunt and an operation. The first visit had been a stunt. This was an investigation, and investigations can become raids. I called an old friend, a man named Reyes, who'd been a comms tech during my 3rd deployment. He answered on the 2nd ring. "You bother me, I come help," he said without any preamble. That's who Reyes was, fewer words than a freight train, but just enough muscle to move a problem. "Reyes, I want eyes on the lane," I said. "I don't trust the HOA. I don't trust anyone wearing a badge who can't show me paperwork, and right now someone's mapping my place." "There's a man in a windbreaker," he said. "Tall, moves like he knows what he's doing. You want me to roll through with a van full of ghost suits?" "No," I said. "Just send someone to sit in a pickup across the road. Plainclothes, listen, take notes. No heroics. If it goes bad, pull back." He grunted his agreement and told me he'd set it up for the day. I slept for 2 hours and woke to Ray's text. "Got a man at the corner. He's listening to the radio, notebook open. Looks bored." "Keep him in sight," I replied. People like that have rituals. They wait for the target to make a mistake, for a gate to be left open, for a dog to bark at midnight, for a truck to honk. They want chaos they can exploit. I made sure there were no rituals to find. Gates stayed latched. The livestock were left in their pens. I drove as if I had places to be, random trips to the feed store, slow errands that showed a life of mundanity. Mundane makes you boring on purpose, boring makes you invisible. The HOA notice came 3 days after I started the surveillance. A formal letter left on the porch, printed on thick paper and signed by the HOA president, a woman whose name I'd seen only once on social media, Lucinda Hale. It was polite, then punitive, a demand to surrender what they called dangerous instruments pending inspection. The wording teetered between bureaucracy and legal threat, a paper sword. I read it twice and then photographed it. It was the kind of paper that tries to be law by screaming at you in courier font. Paper can be challenged, people are harder to move. That evening, the windbreaker man made a mistake. He left his phone at the roadside, face down, as if it didn't belong to him and he wouldn't miss it. He walked away and started to approach my fence line, notebook in hand, and in his approach his hands were too open, too casual. This was a man who wanted to be seen but not engaged. I let him get close enough that the dogs would note him, then I walked out under the porch light like someone who had a reason to be outside at midnight. The dogs came to my sides, tails wagging but eyes sharp. The man froze when he saw me. People always freeze when their rehearsed scripts meet a real human with real consequences. "You lost something?" I asked. He swallowed and smiled. "Just checking the area, neighborhood watch, we're concerned about property values." "Property values," I echoed. "Do you represent the HOA?" He named a woman I didn't recognize, then his smile grew thin. "We're following complaints." "About what?" I asked. He glanced away toward the vacant lane. "About firearms." "On my land," I said. "I own this property. If you want to talk about it, make an appointment. If not, get off it." When he pushed back, "We have to ensure the safety of the community," I let the dogs step forward. That simple movement changed his demeanor. He apologized and left, a quick apology laced with the kind of fear that comes when someone realizes a bluff is being called. Back inside, I took his phone and copied its contents. There was a string of contacts, some city numbers, an HOA central office, and one labeled simply, "Hale." The phone also held photos of the first incident, taken with shaky hands, close-ups of my barn door, my shotgun rack, and a face I didn't recognize. A man with the smug look of someone whose authority had been given to him by a paper signature. I ran the phone's metadata and traced a pattern to a small private security firm 2 towns over. A name came up, Blackbridge Security, LLC. A quick call to a friend who still had inside police contacts confirmed what I suspected. Blackbridge had a history of hearing off-duty cops, private security contractors, and uncomfortably, people who liked playing law in their spare time. They provided neighborhood enforcement to HOAs that wanted plausible deniability. That was the core of it, HOAs outsourcing aggression so they could keep their hands clean. They'd come to my ranch thinking they could make me comply because compliance is cheap and fear is cheaper. They hadn't priced in certainty. I drafted a letter and had Ray's cousin, a paralegal, format it. It was meticulous. I requested official identification from any person representing a civic authority, case law references where applicable, and a demand that no person enter my property without a warrant signed by a judge or a consent form explicitly signed by me. It was the sort of legal theater some people use to hide real intentions, but I wanted paper, and the right kind. I left a copy of the letter with the HOA notice on the porch, tacked under the same mailbox slot. Make them read it, make them document they'd read it. What came next was something I didn't expect. A woman in her 60s, tall, with silver hair pulled back like a matronly soldier, drove up in an old Prius. She came on foot, hands empty, and stopped at the gate. I had seen her in the feeds, Lucinda Hale. Up close, she looked like someone who'd learned to lead committees the way generals learn to lead troops, with an eye for process and a penchant for being seen as reasonable. "Good evening," she said. Her voice held the thin veneer of civility. "I want to talk." I invited her to the porch. She sat like someone expecting to be heard. She said her words slowly, as if arranging them on a table. "Our community is concerned. There have been complaints. We only want to keep everyone safe." "I never threatened anyone," I said. "I own the land. I keep firearms for protection. If your contractor is sending people onto my property without permission, that's illegal." She nodded as if this all was a tragedy neither of us had asked to inherit. "I understand. But there are procedures. We do appreciate you documenting everything. We just want to follow the law," I cut in. Lucinda, I want cooperation, but there's a line. You can't send men who look like police to my gate and expect compliance. She sighed and looked at the horizon, where the last colors of sunset bled into a bruising blue. We thought we were doing the right thing, she said, but I don't condone intimidation. Her eyes were honest. There was an edge of fear of being sued, fear of losing face to the community. I could have dismissed her as part of whatever had set this in motion, but the truth was messier. HOAs are run by optics and measurements of 1,000 petty grievances. They're bureaucracies with claws. Someone else at some point had decided to cross a line, and they'd used Lucinda as a face to the operation. I don't want to be adversarial, I said. You can't have private security make illegal entries. If you want a dialogue, bring it. If you keep sending muscle, I will respond appropriately. She rose to leave and hesitated. There's a board meeting next week. I'll ask them to send someone to meet with you. A lawyer will be present. Fine, I said. Bring the lawyer, bring their contracts with Blackbridge, bring documentation. After she left, I felt the story split into two threads. One was the obvious, men who would keep trying to intimidate me. The other was more complicated. A woman who sounded sincere, who might have been a pawn or a gate or something in between. I couldn't trust it. I couldn't ignore it. I briefed Reyes and the small team of people I trusted. We set rules of engagement. No unnecessary escalation, documentation of every approach, video of every interaction, and an instruction, clear as a bell, that if any person attempted to force entry, we would use proportionate force to protect life and property. That night I slept better than I had 2 nights before. The cameras hummed in the rafters like contented insects. I had evidence, allies, paper, and a plan. But plans are brittle against the human element. The next move would belong to someone else, someone who had chosen bluff over negotiation the first time. Whoever that was, they still didn't understand the man they'd picked a fight with. The quiet before the meeting felt like a held breath. I used it to prepare. I rehearsed what I would say to a lawyer who might try to dress intimidation as legal obligation. I recalled every training scenario where a squad had to hold ground against an inscrutable opponent. I made contingency plans for a forced entry, for a covert surveillance discovery, for a legal trap. I slept with the shotgun under my bed and woke with the taste of iron in my mouth, not fear, but readiness. When the board meeting day came, I went prepared to be reasonable. I went prepared to be dangerous if they forced my hand. The ranch seemed to know the difference. Even the wind seemed to move more carefully around the fence posts. Unknown to the HOA, I had already positioned a few cameras beyond their reach. Knowledge, I'd learned, is the only kind of advantage that never breaks on impact. I walked into that town hall with the serenity of a man who had walked into worse situations and lived to show people the outcome. I planned to speak, to show documents, to ask questions. I did not plan to be surprised. But surprise has its own heartbeat, and I felt it then, like distant thunder. Someone in the room was smiling with the satisfaction of a plan almost complete. Someone else was already scripting my fall. I would find out who, and when I did, they would wish they had never knocked on my gate. The town hall smelled of old wood and coffee gone cold. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, giving the room the antiseptic glow of a doctor's office. A row of folding chairs faced a long table where 5 board members sat, papers neatly stacked in front of them like shields. The center chair, slightly elevated, belonged to Lucinda Hale. Her silver hair caught the light as she adjusted her glasses and gave me a polite but guarded nod. I'd been in rooms like this before. Only then, the tables were sandbags and the men in folding chairs were insurgents or rival operatives. Different uniforms, same postures. People who believed the space belonged to them, who thought you were a guest in their reality. Reyes sat 2 rows behind me, disguised as a man with a notepad and a bored expression. In his shirt pocket was a tiny pen cam. Another friend sat near the exit, pretending to scroll his phone. If anything went sideways, I wouldn't be alone. Lucinda tapped her gavel, though there was no real gavel, only a plastic mallet that clacked against the table. This meeting of the North Ridge Estates Homeowners Association is now in session. Her voice was calm, rehearsed, and slightly brittle. Our first order of business is the complaint regarding property number 27B, Mr. Dalton's ranch. All eyes turned to me. Mr. Dalton, Lucinda said, there have been multiple complaints from residents about firearms stored openly on your property. As you're aware, our community guidelines restrict dangerous items. Our board is concerned for the safety of the neighborhood. I held up the letter they'd sent me. And as you're aware, this property isn't part of your HOA. I purchased my land before your development was built. The county line runs here. I traced a finger across a printed map, and your jurisdiction stops here. My firearms are legal, registered, and stored according to state law. A board member to Lucinda's left, a heavyset man with a gold watch, leaned forward. Our legal team says we have an easement across your land for safety inspections. You signed paperwork acknowledging community standards when you... No, I said calmly, cutting him off. I signed nothing of the kind. Produce the paperwork right now. He shuffled papers, clearly irritated. We can provide that later. That's not how legal authority works, I said. You don't send armed men, I emphasized the words, with fake badges to seize property you have no claim to. That's not an inspection, that's a raid. A murmur rippled through the small audience. Lucinda raised a hand. Mr. Dalton, we had no knowledge of any armed approach to your property. I slid a photo across the table, 3 men in tactical vests standing outside my barn, SUVs behind them. Then who are these people? Lucinda looked at the photo, her lips thinned. I've never seen them. The Gold Watch board member spoke again, voice sharp. Blackbridge Security was contracted for neighborhood patrols. They're licensed, if you resisted their inspection. I didn't resist an inspection, I said. I refused an illegal entry. There's a difference. The man opened his mouth, but Lucinda shot him a glance that silenced him. She studied me with an expression I'd seen on young officers in combat zones, the moment they realized the mission briefing didn't match the battlefield. Mr. Dalton, she said slowly, we contracted Blackbridge to handle trespassers and vandalism. We did not authorize a seizure. I want you to know that. Her voice was sincere, but the way the Gold Watch man shifted in his chair told me everything. Someone had authorized something. I leaned forward. Then you have a rogue contractor, Mrs. Hale, or someone on your board is lying. Either way, next time they come onto my land, it won't end with me asking questions. The heavyset man sneered. Is that a threat? It's a fact, I said, my voice calm but carrying. If anyone forces entry on my property without a warrant, I will defend it as the law allows. Ray's coughed softly behind me, a signal. I didn't need to turn around, I knew the drill. Something was happening at the back of the room. 2 men in suits had just walked in, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, carrying briefcases, but moving like they weren't just lawyers. Their eyes swept the room like cops sweeping a suspect's living room. Gentlemen, Lucinda said with some surprise, this is a closed meeting. We're with Blackbridge Security, one of them said smoothly. We're here to address any concerns. Every instinct in me screamed trap. They hadn't been invited, they had inserted themselves. This was their counterplay, show up, intimidate, reframe the narrative. I stood, facing them squarely. Then you can explain why your men trespassed on my property with fake badges. The taller one smiled. We were conducting a compliance check under HOA guidelines. Show me your warrant, I said. That won't be necessary, he replied. We have contractual authority. I laughed once, low and sharp. Authority? Your private security. You have no power on my land. None. The next time you send men, you send them with a sheriff's deputy and a court order, or you don't send them at all. He spread his hands like a man trying to calm a room. We're only here to keep the community safe. There's no need for hostility. But his eyes gave him away. He wasn't calming anything. He was sizing me up. I'd seen that look in interrogation rooms, in raids, in places where men plotted outcomes they thought they could control. Lucinda was staring at the 2 men now, a muscle jumping in her jaw. She looked at me, then at them. This is the first I've heard of a compliance check, she said firmly. Blackbridge's role is patrol, not enforcement. The shorter man leaned forward. Mrs. Hale, with respect, our contract allows for emergency interventions in matters of safety. This wasn't an emergency, I said. This was theft under color of authority, and it's going to end. The taller man's smile faded. Are you threatening legal action? I'm stating facts, I said. I've documented everything, video, audio, phone records. If you come back without proper legal authority, it will be law enforcement you're answering to, not me. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his expression. We'll review our procedures, he said, his voice less certain now. No one wants trouble. Too late, I said. You've already got it. Lucinda closed the folder in front of her. "This meeting is adjourned," she said, her voice clipped. "Mr. Dalton, thank you for bringing this to our attention." I didn't wait for applause. I walked out, Ray's falling into step behind me. As soon as we were in the truck, he let out a low whistle. "They didn't see that coming," he said. "They'll regroup," I said, eyes on the rearview mirror. The two Blackbridge men were already on their phones, faces tight. "This isn't over." "Got everything on camera," Ray said, tapping his shirt pocket. "Audio too." "Good," I said. "Now we start playing by my rules." We drove back to the ranch under a sky the color of burnished steel. The land rolled out in front of me like a map, every fence post and tree a piece on a board I'd learned to play years ago. I wasn't planning a war, but I was preparing for one. Back home, I went to the barn and opened the locked chest where I kept the old gear. Nothing illegal, just the kind of equipment you accumulate when you've spent a lifetime in operations. Tactical vests, rangefinders, night vision optics, radio sets. I laid them out one by one, reacquainting myself with each. If Blackbridge thought they were playing a game of intimidation, they were about to learn what it felt like when the other side understood tactics, timing, and terrain. That night, as the dogs settled by the door, I sketched out the first phase of my countermove. It wasn't going to be loud. It was going to be precise, documented, and legal, but backed by the kind of readiness that kept people from mistaking calm for weakness. The imposters had come to my land thinking I'd be an easy mark. They just walked into a chess match they didn't even know they were playing. And I never lost a board once I understood the game. I don't like making noise unless it has a purpose. Noise tells people where you are, what you're thinking, and how badly you want something. So I spent a week making the quiet count. The first step was paperwork, boring, deliberate, and surgical. I filed a formal complaint with the county sheriff's office and provided my camera feeds, the phone metadata from the windbreaker man, and the photographs of the SUVs with the fake vinyl badges. Law enforcement listened with professional interest. They said the pattern looked like private security overreach, a gray area that could tip into criminal impersonation. They promised to monitor. It wasn't the thunder I wanted, but cooperative officers are like good weather, predictable and helpful when it matters. Then I made sure the neighbors knew I wasn't the problem. I knocked on doors, handed out copies of the HOA letter, and showed people how the Blackbridge men had trespassed. A few older women clutched the photos. A kid on a dirt bike whistled. Sympathy isn't a weapon, but it makes a lot of other things easier, the sheriff's office being one of them. Any operation that depends on secrecy relies on silence. I wanted as many pairs of eyes awake as possible. Next came the practical stuff, passive defenses and deception. Outside the barn, I planted a few decoy shotguns, cheap, obvious models bolted to deadwood posts with clear property of Dalton tags. They were bait and, more importantly, a test. If Blackbridge or anyone else wanted evidence of firearms for headlines, I'd give them a false trail to follow. The real cash was locked in a reinforced safe inside the concrete foundation under the tack room. The safe's position and construction were a small engineering project I'd completed years before when I still expected problems abroad. It was time it earned its keep. I reworked the perimeter sensors, motion detectors on a low-frequency band that ignored deer but screamed for humans. The cameras were moved in odd arcs. One faced a patch of scrub that could give a single person 20 different angles to be filmed. I layered everything with time-stamped files and off-site backups. Rays handled the comms, encrypted channels, disposable phones for anyone who needed to talk, and a set of mesh radios we used only when necessary. No one who hadn't been vetted got a key. Then I prepared the subtle punishments, nonviolent, humiliating, and irreversible in the way bureaucracy can be. Blackbridge prided themselves on image. They wanted to appear professional. I decided to stain that image in small, public ways. 2 nights later, I began the execution, and I did it like the Navy taught me. Methodical, low signature, timed to the circadian rhythm of the target. The operation had 3 objectives: gather irrefutable evidence of criminal impersonation or illegal entry, degrade Blackbridge's ability to operate with impunity, and expose any legal or political cover that let them act. Phase 1 was discovery. I and a pair of trusted friends, Rays and Marla, an ex-prosecutor who owed me a favor, hid in a dust-smudged pickup on a ridge that overlooked my lane. The truck's bed was full of feed for appearance. Its interior held laptops and a small comms rig. We watched as if the world were a film. Midnight came, and with it the familiar sound of tires in sand. 2 SUVs rolled into the lane, headlights dimmed. The lead vehicle slowed and stopped at the point where the dirt arced out of sight. Two men climbed out. One wore a jacket with a poorly stitched badge. They paused, shuffled papers under flashlights, and then, curious and stupid, moved toward the barn gate. We watched them cross the invisible line into my property. This was what I had hoped for, a voluntary trespass after dark with no lawman's presence. Reyes clicked the transmitter and slid the camera that had been mounted in the catenary wire up into a tree limb. The motion sensor picked them up and started recording. We carried a second, high-resolution camera in some bushes near the barn and trained it so it would show the entire approach. Both recorded, both uplinked. Marla whispered into the earpiece, "If they step past the fence, it's aggravated trespass. Make sure you have their plates." They did step past. One of them, a younger man with an easy smile like someone who'd been promised a paycheck for pretending, shone a light directly at the cheap decoys. He called softly to the other, "Looks like he's got some toys out." The other authoritatively tapped his fake badge and muttered something about community safety. They left after 10 minutes with nothing, but the footage preserved their faces, the badges, and the SUV's license plates. We had plates, timestamps, and clear audio of them discussing confiscation if they returned with paperwork. Phase 2 was interruption. Blackbridge relied on predictable patterns: arrive, intimidate, retreat to the office, get paid. I interrupted the pattern. Dawn, a woman from my local news, called the ranch to ask about a tip. Unusual security patrols around the subdivision. I had not called her. But timing is everything in media. Once a story is sown, curious people water it. I fed the reporter with what was available: anonymized clips, stills of the SUVs, and copies of the HOA letter tacked to my porch. The reporter smelled a story about extra-legal enforcement and called Blackbridge. They denied everything, as you'd expect. The story ran that evening online with a headline that made Blackbridge sound precisely the kind of private army people fear. Their comments section filled with angry neighbors and legal questions. That's the thing about public exposure. It complicates business models built on plausible deniability. Around noon, I sent an email, direct, sterile, and with attachments, to the developer who controlled the HOA's contracts. I appended the sheriff's preliminary notes and the surveillance clips we'd captured. I CC'd the county attorney and left the subject line blunt: Blackbridge security, possible impersonation, and trespass. The email pinged into municipal ears where contracts lived. Procurement doesn't like risk. Developers don't like risk tied to litigation. That afternoon, the developer's procurement office called Blackbridge to announce a review and an immediate pause to patrol operations. Within 24 hours, Blackbridge's patrol schedule became an internal policy review. Phase 3 was humiliation with teeth. I found the man who'd shown up at the board meeting with his polished shoes and hollow authority. He frequented a cafe a half-hour away, small town, predictable breakfast hours. I bought a table nearby and let him sit with his coffee, looking around for the aura of security that comes with a paycheck. I did not approach him. Instead, a freelance videographer, a friend of Marla's, sat near enough to capture his every gesture. We collected evidence of his meetings, his calls with Blackbridge numbers, and crucially, his conversation with a county contractor who joked about legal gymnastics. Even the smallest slip can be a rope. We'd collected enough knots. The developer's procurement office, pressured by the incoming emails, paused Blackbridge while they ran a standard compliance audit. The men who liked to wear fake badges were told to stand down. Their boss denied any imposters had been instructed to impersonate law enforcement. But denials matter less when you're holding plate numbers and audio where men talk about seizing guns. By the time the board convened again, Lucinda was quieter, the weight of municipality emails pressing at her shoulders. I watched her from the back of the room as the developer's representative read a brief summary of the audit's findings: poor contractor oversight, unclear rules about private security, and most damaging, no documentation authorizing any seizure of property by Blackbridge. The room smelled of burnt confidence. The gold watch man fidgeted in his seat. He was a person who'd been banking on friction. But I wasn't interested in performing retribution for the sake of spectacle. I wanted to make sure a line had been drawn and that anyone who crossed it would pay a price not merely in reputation but in legal exposure. I delivered the evidence to the county attorney: plates, photos, audio, timestamps. Marla had annotated everything, noting the statutes that fit their behavior. The county attorney read them carefully, nodded, and then told me something that made the adrenaline drag out of my chest like a slow, satisfied sigh. This is enough to start an investigation into impersonation and trespass. We'll handle it from here if you let us. I let the legal machinery do its smooth, blunt work. It felt clean. But Blackbridge's removal from patrols didn't end the problem. Someone had greenlit their approach, someone on the board or someone with business ties. That was the part that smelled like rot. If the board had been a single rotten apple, the rest of the basket might yet be salvageable. If rot had spread to the developer's office, I needed to know. That's when the second, darker aim of the counterstrike became imperative: find the authorizer. We set a lure. I published a short, tightly worded op-ed in the county paper under my name describing the incident as a cautionary tale about private enforcement on private land. I asked pointed questions. Who signed the contract that allowed private security to patrol adjacent private properties? What vetting had been done on those contractors? The op-ed created a small civic uproar and drew emails from people who'd been skirting around the edges of the story. One anonymous tip came through an email server we'd set up and routed through a VPN, a scanned copy of an invoice. It had been carelessly redacted, but not perfectly. A single line was legible. Consulting fee, Goldwatch Enterprises, $12,500. Goldwatch Enterprises. The name matched the man with the gold watch in my meetings. Coincidence? I don't believe in coincidences the way people believe in luck. I believe in patterns. Reyes and I followed the paper trail like bloodhounds. We traced wire transfers, invoices, and a chain of subcontractors. What we found was the kind of small-time corruption that's easy to hide in a network of good intentions. A local contractor who frequently did consulting for HOAs, a developer who preferred quick solutions to bureaucratic hassles, and a middleman who enjoyed the easy money of keeping problems from turning legal. The invoices led to a shell company and back again, small commissions paid to obscure accounts, cash pulled out in envelopes at a bank window. I compiled everything and presented it to the county attorney. They called it probable cause and promised to escalate. The sheriff's office did what they should have. They issued subpoenas and took statements. One by one, people's stories unraveled under the weight of records and recordings. People who'd been brave enough to sign contracts with private security suddenly remembered nothing. Others confessed to being under pressure from the developer to keep community standards high. The more we pushed, the more the map of intent came into focus. There was never a firefight. I didn't want one. What I wanted was resolution and deterrence. The devils I chased wore suits more often than camo. They could be Pied Pipers, bureaucrats, or men who liked to flex power for the taste of it. The law had teeth if you let it bite. In the end, the developer put Blackbridge on indefinite suspension pending a full audit. Goldwatch Enterprises was pulled from contract negotiations, and the HOA board voted to cancel any patrol contracts until stronger oversight was in place. Lucinda called me, and without theatrics, thanked me for bringing proof instead of noise. She sounded tired, chastened, and small, like someone who had realized that running a committee can become dangerous when you let expedience rule. It would have been enough. A restraint, a public humiliation for men who tried to treat my land like an appendage of their authority. But it wasn't quite over. There remained the question of motive. Someone had wanted the shotguns, more exactly, someone had wanted control. Whether it was fear of a neighbor's arms, a desire to exert power, or the promise of a contract, I could not let it go unanswered. So I sat on the ridge one night under an angled moon and watched the lane. Quiet had taught me more than noise ever could. I knew degrees of intent by how people moved under cover, by the cadence of their steps, and by the way they looked at a property that was a home rather than a target. A final piece of information came not from cameras or invoices, but from a conversation overheard at a local hardware store. A mention of liabilities and easier insurance if the firearms were off the books. It was a small city-level bookkeeping plan, a developer trying to lower premiums by reducing perceived risks. The more I peeled back, the more mundane the motive became. Often the ugliest things are the most banal. The law took its course. Some men apologized in press statements that smelled of lawyers. Others quietly disappeared into contract work where their names mattered less. The sheriff issued warnings about impersonation and reminded private security firms that impersonating a police officer is a felony. The dev who thought a private solution could fix a civic problem found himself answering a lot of inconvenient questions. I slept differently after the suits were pried from their perch. Sleep wasn't sweeter, just quieter. The barn felt less like a fortress and more like the honest, creaking home it had always been. Yet in the end, the victory wasn't mine alone. It belonged to the small things, a neighbor who now felt safer, a sheriff's department that started asking more questions about private contractors, and an HOA board that, for the first time since I moved in, realized that patrolling power without oversight can become a liability for everyone. On the ridge one dawn, as sunlight cut across the field like a blade, Lucinda drove up in her old Prius. She climbed out with two forms in hand, a new policy draft and a promise she said she meant. "We've rescinded the Blackbridge contract until we have oversight," she told me. "We're instituting transparency measures. We want your input." Her eyes were clear. I could tell she meant it. The paper backed her up. I took the forms, signed where it made sense, and wrote one sentence in the margin. "No one enforces outside of law." It was as close to a truce as anyone could give without giving up the right to defend anything at all. The lane remained quiet for weeks. The cameras hummed. The dogs slept near the barn door and woke only to the small noises of their lives. The world beyond the porch did not chain. It never does in the ways you hope, but the people in it were a little less willing to cross a line. That, in my book, was worth the effort. Still, I kept my kit accessible. Navy protocol teaches you one immutable truth: deterrence is only as good as your willingness to act on it. I had proven the first part. The second part was a promise I never intended to break. The county's machinery moves slowly, like ice flows grinding into place. It's deliberate, noisy in its own way, and governed by rules that are meant to keep people honest. The sheriff's deputies issued subpoenas. The county attorney filed a complaint into the local court. Blackbridge's vans sat idle in a lot outside town, their vinyl logos peeling in the sun like question marks. Goldwatch Enterprises tried a terse statement about miscommunication and community safety, which read like a confession in a court of public opinion. The press circulated the story with the kind of appetite that swells a rumor into a reputation. For me, the noise of authority was different from the quiet of a home at dawn. The sheriff called often, formal, respectful, asking for additional recordings, clarifications, and testimony. Marla took the deposition sessions like a prosecutor who had learned how to be patient for the truth. Rays handled logistics. Neighbors came by with casseroles and stories, their faces softening around the edges of the problem now that it had names and statutes attached. Small towns behave like family sometimes. Gossip at first, then solidarity when someone in the family looks weaker than they seemed. Court dates were set. Blackbridge's CEO, a man with a carefully combed part and a voice used to confident boardrooms, made the mistake of showing up on TV to denounce the claims. He had an array of PR talking points, but very little to anchor them. The judge, a woman who wore common sense like a tailored coat, did not blink at my stacks of time-stamped footage and receipts. The evidence was mundane in the best way. Plates, audio, contracts, and an invoice with a barely redacted annotative line that read like an authorizing signature. It is surprisingly hard to invent friends who sign your paperwork. The legal outcome, when it finally arrived, felt anticlimactic and necessary at once. Blackbridge was fined, its contract annulled in multiple jurisdictions, and the CEO received a civil judgment for negligence and unauthorized action. Goldwatch Enterprises lost a line of HOA clients, and with them, a comfortable stream of consulting fees that had been far too easy. The county attorney recommended criminal referrals for a handful of people involved in impersonation and trespass. Some folk were vilified in op-eds, some quietly closed their businesses and moved on. The law bit slow, but it bit. The court's judgment did more than punish. It set precedent in a way that writers and pundits love. Private security firms could no longer operate in the gray by confusing the veneer of authority with the reality of it. The sheriff gave a short interview about impersonation laws. The county council scheduled hearings. The developer issued a public apology and restructured their procurement policies to prevent the delegation of civic action to private contractors without clear oversight. It was, in short, the kind of adulting the county rarely performed without a scandal. Lucinda Hale kept her promise as best she could. She became the kind of leader who learns that being seen as reasonable and actually being reasonable are two separate crafts. Under pressure, she voted to cancel all patrol contracts and opened the board to community review. She invited me to draft language for a transparency clause and to sit in on procurement reviews. I accepted the offer with the caveat that my involvement would be practical and short-term. I would advise on oversight, not run an armory out of the HOA's janitor closet. There was something else that came from the aftermath that nobody expected. A new conversation in town about fear. It's always been easier to imagine strangers as threats than neighbors as complicated people. The county's hearings pulled neighbors into a room where they had to ask hard questions. Who benefits from fear? What are the costs of security? when security becomes an excuse for seeing power. People who had voted for private patrols or looked the other way now had to answer why. A woman named Kathy, whose fence met the far corner of my property, came to the barn one afternoon with fresh-baked bread and a folded list. On it were the names of neighbors who wanted cameras shared on a secure feed, an offer to organize a community safety fair, and a suggestion that the HOA sponsor a gun safety class open to everyone who lived nearby. We talked for a long time on the porch about how fear can be monetized and how authority can be sold. She wanted to be part of a fix. I gave her what time I could. The classes were a modest thing. A retired county deputy taught safety and storage law. A volunteer from a local nonprofit showed how to de-escalate tense neighbor disputes. Marla came with plain language guides on legal recourse and how to challenge private contractors. We all sat in the old school gym, the lights buzzing, and talked about what it meant to be a neighbor rather than an adversary. It was, in its small way, a restoration. Inside my barn, the shotgun stayed locked in the safe. I kept some decoys bolted to posts by the road because sometimes gestures are part of negotiation, a visible reminder that my property was private and my rights were intact. People asked why I hadn't simply sold the firearms and avoided trouble. It was a fair question, coded in a dozen shades of curiosity and prejudice. The answer was practical and stubborn. Those firearms represented more than metal. They were a ritual of independence for a man who had once lived in a world where unpredictability was a paycheck. They were also a legal right, and something I had a responsibility to manage carefully. There were moments when I let my Navy past be a story to tell, and others when it felt like a secret I shielded. Veterans, I learned, carry two chronologies, one of missions and one of everyday life, and the trick is letting them coexist without letting either dominate. I taught a small class at the safety fair about situational awareness and the difference between preparation and paranoia. I did not teach techniques that could be used to violate others' rights. I spoke about documentation, reporting, and the value of legal recourse. At night, sometimes, I would drive the lane and watch the porch lights flicker on in houses I'd only recently come to know. The world out here had been rearranged. People who had been quick to point fingers were now more likely to ask questions. The developer's apology had rippled into actual policy change. The sheriff's office had a new hand in procurement oversight. The HOA board had become, if not humble, then at least attentive. There were, of course, costs. Some men whose reputations had been tarnished threatened lawsuits that never materialized. A couple of people stopped speaking to members of the board. Blackbridge lawyers did the predictable thing and sent letters demanding retractions, but the court's record swatted them away. The county's processes were slow and deliberate. They were also public. That transparency turned whispers into documents. Documents turn into action. For me, the quiet that followed the storm felt less like a sigh of relief and more like a pledge. I kept my cameras in place, but I turned off their live feed from time to time and sat on the porch with a thermos. Ray's and I would joke about the theater of it all, and the way men in tailored suits thought the world could be governed by invoices and bravado. Marla came by to see us sometimes, bringing file folders and a smile that suggested she would rather be anywhere than in small-town committee drama. We laughed sometimes at the absurdity of it, the way power masquerades in many costumes. Weeks after the final ruling, a small piece of paper arrived on my porch. It was handwritten in an even script. "Thank you for the courage and the civility. Neighbors." I thumbed it between my fingers and thought of the men who'd come to my gate with fake badges, of the developer who'd looked for shortcuts, and of Lucinda, who'd had the integrity to change when confronted with truth. I placed the note on the barn wall like a small medal for an argument well fought. There's a type of calm that is earned and a type that is cowardice. I had had opportunities to convert this fight into vengeance, to make a spectacle that would satisfy a certain dark joy. But vengeance is an appetite that consumes more than the target, and the last thing I wanted was to trade the moral clarity I'd found for the rough pleasure of seeing someone humiliated. What I wanted was accountability, precedent, and a community that could stand up for the law and each other. Months later, on a cool morning with frost like powdered sugar on the grass, Lucinda stopped by the gate. She had a binder in her hand, new HOA policies printed on recycled paper, and she stood in the sunlight with a little smile that was almost apologetic and almost relieved. "You were right about one thing," she said. "We did need oversight, we did need transparency." "And you were right about another," I replied. "This is a neighborhood, we can do better." I extended my hand, she took it. We both knew how fragile such gestures can be, but they matter. The sheriff's office made a point at the county meeting to thank the residents for their cooperation. The developer revised their contracts. Blackbridge reinvented itself under a new name and far more quietly under a new code. People moved on, but with an extra layer of attention. That, perhaps, was the true victory, people paying attention to the ways authority is exercised. In the evenings, I still walked the fence line. The dogs followed, ears perked for the small sounds of field life, owl calls, distant engines, the soft clink of a cow's bell. I would stop sometimes and look at the horizon where the sun would sink in a blur of indigo. My hands that once pushed buttons inside a cockpit and braced for landings, now rested on a wooden fence rail. I thought of mission briefs and neighborhood notices, of fake badges and real laws. The world shrank to the size of the porch light and the size of the note on the barn wall. There is a lesson in all of that I try to keep close. Vigilance without paranoia, readiness without aggression, defense without escalation. The Navy taught me how to operate under pressure. Life taught me how to live beside people who make messes and then ask for forgiveness when the mess is exposed. It's a smaller craft than a raid, but it's more crucial. One evening, as twilight bled into night, a young couple drove up the lane. They had a toddler in a car seat and a moving truck in tow. They were first-time homeowners with wide eyes and a nervous laugh. They'd stopped because they'd seen the note on the barn and wanted to introduce themselves. We talked for a long time, about the land, about the town, about why people own property and what it means to be a neighbor. The dog leaned against the woman's leg as if offering approval. When they left, the world was quiet again, but not the hollow quiet of a place where silence is the result of fear. This was a quiet that felt like conversation. Neighbors who knew each other, who questioned power when it overreached, and who relied on law and decency to resolve disputes. It was the kind of quiet that is hard-won and worth keeping. I locked the barn, checked the safe, and sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee until the stars took over the sky. The fight had changed things. Not all of it was pretty, but it was necessary. I had responded the way I knew how, with discipline, with documentation, with measured force reserved for when it was required. The barn, the land, the note on the wall, none of it was victory alone. It was life, patched up where it had been torn, ready for the next dawn. The dogs drifted off to sleep at my feet. The porch light hummed a thin, steady note. The quiet was not peace so much as preparation, calm, watchful, and human. I breathed it in and let it settle. The world would always provide reasons to be afraid. Sometimes it takes stubborn people with recorders and court filings and a willingness to show up to make anything better. And for now, that was enough. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.